If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you the most brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. Kew Gardens is an incredible research source, which makes it way more than just a mere garden. It's actually a living, breathing archive of the world's botanical history, a place where every tree and flower tells a story of adventure, science, and discovery. With centuries of meticulously catalogued specimens, rare manuscripts, and groundbreaking research, Kew actually brings together knowledge from literally all over the globe. It's where plant hunters' treasures are kept. It's where imperial ambitions started. It's where cutting-edge conversation all meet, making it the go-to place for anyone who wants to trace the roots, excuse the pun, of the world's plants, to understand how botany actually shaped empires, and a place where you can unlock new solutions for our planet's future, all in one incredible green sanctuary. Most people, when they step through those old iron gates, see the flowers and the lawns and the grand glasshouses, all the outward signs of a great public garden, I have to say. But the real story of Kew lies just beneath the surface, in the soil and the seed banks, in the quiet work of botanists and explorers. Let me just tell you now, Kew isn't just a garden. It's a living archive, a treasure trove, and if you look closely enough, the very heart of a changing world. The great thing about Kew, I think, is that it actually started as a royal curiosity, as so many things in Britain do. 18th century royalty wanted more than gardens to walk in. They wanted to bring the world to their home. Princess Augusta began collecting exotic plants long before Kew had become a grand experiment, a place where every corner of the empire sent its botanical spoils. Just imagine it, ships unloading crates from the Cape, from Java, from the Americas for the first time, each one packed with seeds and samples, saplings, and the hope of discovery. Each plant actually was a piece of a vast imperial puzzle. But Kew, of course, wasn't just showing off. That's not Kew's way. In the 19th century, as Britain's ambitions spread and the empire expanded, Kew became something else entirely. It became the nerve center for scientific intelligence. It's here where fortunes were made and lost, sometimes on the back of a single flower or tree. The world's first rubber seedlings outside Brazil, raised at Kew, then whisked off to Malaysia, changing the face of Asia for centuries to come. Quinine, the miracle cure for malaria, propagated and shipped out to protect those who tried to tame the tropics. Kew was the empire's green engine, humming quietly behind the scenes, making sure that the wheels were able to keep turning. I happen to think there's also a romance to it. The stories of daring plant hunters smuggling seeds past customs, battling jungles and disease. And yes, there's a dark side too. There's the transfer of knowledge, sometimes taken without asking, sometimes given freely. But there's always consequences. But you know what? It's all there, woven into the fabric of Kew's story. This is where you find the roots of global trade, colonial ambition, and scientific progress, all tangled and weaved together beneath London's plane trees. But the magic of Kew doesn't end with empire. As the world changed, so did its mission. Today, Kew is at the front line of conservation. Its seed banks hold the DNA of thousands of endangered species, a verifiable Noah's Ark for plants. The research done here is racing against time. It's effectively fighting to save the diversity that underpins life on Earth. Every time you walk beneath the soaring glass of the palm house, you're surrounded by plants that have actually shaped economies, saved lives, and one day may do so again. So when people ask me why Q matters, I tell them this: you can walk its paths in a single afternoon, but you're also wandering through centuries of history, of empires that have risen and fallen, of discoveries that changed the fate of millions, of quiet revolutions in green. Kew Gardens is, quite simply, one of the most important places on Earth where the past, the present, and the future of humanity are all rooted in the very same soil. And if you really want to know how the world was remade, not just by armies and maps, but by living things, then you put on your best walking shoes and you join me in this podcast because I'm going to take you on a stroll through Kew Gardens. But this isn't just a stroll through these amazing gardens, it's a walk through the tangled roots of empire, science, power, and the very shape of the world that we know today. Let's imagine it's a gentle spring morning. The Thames is sliding quietly by, a hint of dew still clinging to the lawns, the air rich with the scent of new growth. You cross Kew Green, a few early joggers padding past, and the gates of the world's most famous garden loom ahead, wrought iron, gilded with the pride of centuries. As we step inside, straight away you can feel the pulse of history in the gravel underfoot. Look around. Over there, the ancient pagoda, built in a burst of 18th century chinoiserie and imperial folly to impress the court and the crowds. Beyond that, a regiment of glasshouses rising in the mist, the palm house, the temperate house, all shimmering with the promise of the unknown. But here's the secret. Every path you take at Kew is a path first trodden by someone with big dreams and an even bigger appetite for the exotic. So, let's start with the basics. Why gardens? Why plants? Because for the men and women who built empires of Europe, plants weren't just pretty, they were power. And the story starts long before Kew, back in a world where every monarch, every sultan, every wealthy merchant wanted to outdo his rival with a more dazzling collection of living treasure. Imagine Henry VIII, bored with politics, bored with his wives, wandering the avenues of Hampton Court, impatient to see if his imported mulberries will take root. Hampton Court, just as a segue, is also where Capability Brown personally planted the vine that still sits in the greenhouse more than 400 years later. Imagine you're a Medici of Florence, pouring fortunes into the Orto Botanico di Padova, Padua's psychic garden, which was founded in 1545. These weren't just pleasure gardens, they were living laboratories, museums of ambition, and I have to say, if we're honest, bragging rights made visible. By the late 1600s, European royalty are locked in what you might call a horticultural arms race. Citrus from Persia, rice from China, coffee from Yemen, tulips from Turkey. Every royal and every noble household wants their own botanical marvels. These were symbols of global reach, not just wealth. Imagine this: if you could make a date palm fruit in Surrey, you were someone to be reckoned with. So it's not just about the plants, it's about the architecture too. These early botanic gardens become playgrounds for the imagination. There's follies, there's pagodas, there's miniature temples, there's even grottos filled with imported seashells. Gardens become a kind of theatre for empire, a way to, I suppose, display not just taste, but control over nature itself. And of course, that brings me to the Arab traders and the global exchange. Because the British and their European cousins are kind of latecomers to this game. Long before Kew, it was Arab traders who crisscrossed the old world with their cargoes of seeds and saplings. They would have brought melons and mulberries and sugarcane and citrus fruits and cotton, tracing effectively an invisible web that stretched from the Malacca Straits to Moorish Spain. The great medieval gardens, lush, walled, rich with fountains, owed as much to Damascus and Baghdad as to London and Paris. In fact, many of the plants that would later become staples of empire Bananas, pepper, nutmeg, cloves had already traveled the world many times before the first European botanist ever set foot in a glasshouse. Let's just move a little further along the gravel path, past the first magnolias and the whisper of running water. We're now in the era of the psychic garden. London's Chelsea Psychic Garden was founded in 1673, and it's a serious, almost monastic place. It's here that plants are grown not just for beauty, but for medicine, for spice, and for the very serious business of keeping sailors alive on their very long voyages. Just think about that for a second. The race for nutmeg, for pepper, for cloves. These are the real drivers of early empire. When the Portuguese round the Cape of Good Hope, or when the Dutch and the English, build their trading posts in the East Indies, it's not gold they're searching for, it's plants, spices that can preserve meat, that can cure the plague, or fetch absolute fortunes at market. It's here that we see the first outlines of what will become the global botanical network, a world in which the movement of a single seed could actually change the fate of nations for centuries to come. And on that, let's just pause for a second. Over there, a blackbird is picking at the soil by a clump of snowdrops, oblivious to my grand narrative. But look closer. These gardens, these modest flower beds, are the proving ground for empires, because as the royal and psychic gardens grow, a new idea is stirring: classification. How do you make sense of a world where every ship brings back a new curiosity? How do you turn chaos into order? How do you display that knowledge? And how do you then turn that knowledge into power? Now, let's duck into the shade of this great oak. Here, the story takes a turn towards science. Carl Linnaeus is a Swedish, eccentric, fiercely methodical botanical fiend. And he looks at the botanical chaos of the 18th century and thinks there has to be a better way. So he does something truly revolutionary. He invents a new language for plants, not by leaf or by color, by sex. The Linnaean system, the way of classifying plants by their number and arrangement of stamens and pistils, completely transforms botany into a science fit for the age of reason. Suddenly, every new plant collected, from a Tahitian breadfruit to a Peruvian potato, can actually be slotted into a universal framework. It's order from chaos, and it accelerates the imperial race for this green gold. Now, you might think this is just a technicality, but Linnaeus' system has consequences. It gives botanists the confidence to collect more, to send out ever more ambitious expeditions, and to imagine that every plant on Earth can be known, catalogued, and if possible, put to work. And of course, that then leads to an explosion of gardens, an explosion of empire. By now, we're well into the 18th and 19th centuries. So let's keep walking, because the gardens are starting to fill with even more stories. Every bed and border at Kew is now a living document of empire, a specimen brought from the Cape, a tree from Calcutta, a rare orchid from Borneo. And what actually started as a handful of botanic gardens, Padua, Chelsea, Leiden, it's become a global network. By the time Victoria ascends the throne, the British Empire's network of gardens is 10 strong. By her death in 1901, it's 126 strong, each one its own laboratory, a nursery, a staging post for economic and scientific ambition. And at the very center, drawing together the threads from every continent and every story that we've just glimpsed, stands Kew. Let's pause for a moment beneath the shadow of the Joseph Banks building. And you'll notice that there's a particular hush here, as if the wolves are listening for another tale. And Joseph Banks, well, there's a man who never let a good story slip by. And I'll talk about him just towards the end of this podcast, because he's imperative to what actually takes place at Kew. But it's as a young adult that Banks actually makes his mark. He buys, literally buys his way onto Captain Cook's first great voyage. Just imagine that for a moment. The king himself actually contributes £4,000 to fund the expedition. Banks, not to be outdone, throws in £10,000 of his own money. That's the modern equivalent of £1.5 million today, just to go plant hunting at the ends of the earth. Cook's endeavour sets out in 1768, heading south and west into the unknown. And of course, on board, all because of Banks, are not just sailors and soldiers, but artists and scientists, all at Banks' insistence. And of course, two expert botanists to join him, Daniel Solander and Hermann Sporing. And of course, the Endeavour's itinerary actually reads like a fantasy cruise. They're going to Madeira, to Rio de Janeiro, to Cape Horn, to New Zealand, to Tahiti. And along the way, Banks and his crew collect, catalogue, and draw over 30,000 plant specimens. When they land in Australia, Cook actually names the anchorage Stingray Harbour. But Banks, awed by the flora, soon persuades Cook to rename it Botany Bay. I know Botany Bay very well. I've dived it literally hundreds of times. It's quite a special place. There's a silence there that's actually very hard to explain. And if you stand with me here on that bluff and close your eyes, you can almost see them. Their ship at anchor, the strange birds overhead, the click and scratch of quills recording a completely new world. No European has been here before. Banks isn't just collecting plants, he's actually laying the foundation for a new kind of empire, one built not just on conquest, but on living things. Banks's legacy is everywhere at Kew, and as I said, I will talk about him in more detail just towards the end of this podcast, so fear not. Fear not. You will understand why he's so important. But back then, he actually returns a celebrity, and he joins the Royal Society, and he becomes a very close advisor to King George III. And what he ends up doing is pushing Kew to the forefront of global science, transforming what was effectively a hobby garden into the beating heart of botanical and economic power. With that in mind, let's move over to the palm-lined avenue for a darker story, the tale of breadfruit. In Tahiti, Banks encounters a strange, fleshy fruit that he thinks could be the answer to a pressing imperial problem: how to cheaply feed the growing armies of enslaved people working the sugar plantations of the West Indies. It's astounding, isn't it? It's also classic imperial logic. Don't let the enslaved grow their own food because they might get ideas. Just feed them something abundant and bland. So Banks actually lobbies hard for an expedition to bring breadfruit from the South Pacific to the Caribbean slave islands. And of course, then enters into history the ill-fated HMS Bounty with Captain Bligh at the helm. And of course, we all know what happened next. There's the mutiny, the open boat, and of course, the legend that then follows. And believe me, Bligh was a sailor unlike any other. But lost in all the adventure is the fact that when breadfruit actually finally arrives in the Caribbean, the enslaved people refuse to eat it. To them, it's animal feed, and it's not fit for humans. But here's a twist that history loves. Centuries later, breadfruit actually becomes a cherished part of the Jamaican diet. Cultures change, food ways adapt, but the shadow of exploitation always lingers. By the mid-19th century, under Sir William Hooker and his son, Joseph Hooker, Kew actually becomes the nerve center of what's now called economic botany, the idea that plants are actually technology and that technology is power. The Museum of Economic Botany opens in 1847, and it's filled with everyday miracles: palm canes, wax, fibers, spices, and most crucially, quinoa, the Peruvian bark that eventually gives us quinine. Quinoa is, in its way, as completely revolutionary as the steam engine. You know, before quinine, Europeans couldn't survive long in malaria-ridden West Africa. You know, mortality rates for white settlers there were as high as 300% per year. effectively meaning that if you didn't have quinine, the average colonist would die more than once a year, if such a thing were, of course, possible. But with quinine, suddenly the white man's grave becomes open for business. And this is how and why the scramble for Africa begins. Let's just take a stroll through the Museum of Economic Botany, which still stands today, and imagine glass cabinets filled with specimens from every part of the empire. Here you'll see a palm branch fashioned into a walking stick. There, blocks of latex. Here, a ball of indigo dye. There, a roll of Indian jute. For Victorians, these just weren't curiosities, they were the lifeblood of global trade. One of the sections here is dedicated to cinchona, the bark with its precious quinine that made European conquest of not just Africa, but India possible. You'll also find cocoa, tea, sugar, opium poppies, each with its own web of incredible stories of fortunes that were made and lost, of peoples displaced, of landscapes that were transformed forever. And while we're here, let's just pause at a single object. A tiny glass vial of rubber sap, creamy, white, and faintly sticky. That innocuous liquid will change the world. Natural rubber is a miracle material. It's stretchy, it's tough, it's waterproof, and for centuries, it's a South American monopoly, fiercely guarded. Rubber trees, Havere Braziliensis, only grow wild in the Amazon, and the local peoples who harvest it are, by turn, enslaved, murdered, or driven from their land as European and American demand skyrockets. Then comes the great heist. Henry Wickham, in the employ of Q, smuggles 70,000 rubber seeds out of Brazil in 1876. Most of them actually die on the voyage, but a few actually make it to Ceylon, and then to Singapore, and then to Malaya, where British planters, who were facing an absolute collapse in coffee prices, plow up their estates and plant rubber instead. And of course, the transformation is breathtaking. In just 5 years, more than 12,000 acres in Malaya alone are given over to rubber. And soon, Malaya plantations, rooted in seeds from Q, are supplying the world's demand for tires, for hoses, and for industrial goods. And of course, the profits are astronomical. And of course, the social upheaval even more so. And of course, there's a cost. Forced labor, land theft, and eventually violent resistance. The Malayan emergency of 1948, I have to say, is triggered not just by politics, but by the disruption of land and life by the rubber barons during the rubber boom. The British actually respond with the old imperial toolkit: mass resettlement, crop destruction, and brutal counterinsurgency. Q's legacy, you see, is both miracle and menace. An engine, I suppose, of innovation and an accomplice to some of the ugliest stories of the modern age. Let's take a short break and a message from our sponsor. Orchids is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Orchids, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. As we stroll further, our shoes crunching on gravel, and suddenly the palm houses rise before us, an absolute cathedral of glass, 16,000 panes glittering in the shifting English light. Even now, after all these years, it never fails to take my breath away. This is not just a greenhouse, it's a monument to ambition, to science, and to the belief that the world, in all its variety, could be brought under one shining dome. As you step inside, the air changes perceptibly. The temperature jumps, the humidity wraps around you like a damp velvet cloak. Giant fronds arch overhead, trunks spiral upwards. The smell is green, it's alive, and it's slightly overwhelming. And for Victorian visitors, the palm house was a ticket to the tropics, a miracle in metal and glass, a window into faraway lands that most of them would never ever see. The plants inside were more than just specimens, they were the trophies of empire, brought home at immense cost, symbols of dominion, if you like, as much as curiosity. Look closely, and you'll see plants that once reshaped entire economies. Palms whose sap became sugar, alcohol, or wax, whose wood fashioned canes and crates, whose oils turned up in soap and margarine. And behind each leaf, a story of migration, of conquest, of people moved and unmoved, willingly or otherwise. Queen Victoria absolutely adored the palm house, and she visited 3 times in the first 6 weeks after it opened in 1848. And for her, as for countless Britons, this was the closest she would ever come to India or to Africa. Her empire, gathered and displayed, made safe and familiar behind glass. Interestingly, Victoria never ever left the British Isles. She never went to India. She never stepped foot in Africa. And I think it's easy, as we walk these steamy paths to forget what it took to bring these plants here. The explorers hacking through jungle, the porters and the sailors risking fever and shipwreck, the gardeners back home experimenting endlessly to coax life from foreign soil. There's wonder here, but also violence, a legacy, I think, which is etched in every leaf and every pane. Let's slip out of the palm house and across the lawns to a building many visitors happen to miss, the Mariana North Gallery. This, I have to say, is actually one of my favorite stories and one that says so much about that era. Mariana North, the daughter of a wealthy MP, could have spent her days at teas and dances. Instead, she inherits a fortune and decided to see the world for herself. Imagine a woman traveling alone, painting landscapes and plants from Java to Jamaica, from Brazil to Ceylon. How exotic. And her paintings are dazzling, almost feverish, if you like. The vivid colors, the outside blooms, landscapes that really seem to pulse with heat and mystery. In 1879, she persuades Kew's director, Joseph Hooker, to let her build her own gallery, on the condition that her paintings are always on display. Even now, there's 800 of them that line the walls. And it's a verifiable world tour in oil and canvas. A reminder, I think, that curiosity and courage could sometimes break through the barriers of, glass and gender. So Mariana North's art is not about perfect classification or imperial order. It's about seeing, it's about experiencing the living wildness of the world in all its strangeness and beauty, and she captures it unbelievably well. But even she is actually part of the imperial machine. Her journey is made possible by the same network of empire, her subjects shaped by colonial roads, plantations, and of course patronage. Now, let's find a quiet bench beneath the shade of an old cedar and talk about something a little bit darker. The entanglement of botany and the making of racial hierarchies. Carl Linnaeus, that tireless classifier, didn't just arrange plants by sex. He actually classified humans too, by geography and by appearance, with chilling confidence. And I think that's the thing that strikes me most, and also by supposed character. In Linnaeus' system, Europeans were inventive, law-abiding. Africans were crafty, indolent, governed by caprice. The poison of these ideas actually seeped into every aspect of science and society. And I think it also justified slavery and colonialism and a brutal sense of superiority that would actually echo for centuries. Even into the late 20th century, the language of botany was littered with racist terms, common plant names containing slurs, colonial hangovers, if you like, hiding in plain sight. I have to say, Kew Gardens, for all its beauty, has always had shadows. We can walk here, we can delight in the colors and the scents, but we also must remember what was erased, what was taken, and how knowledge and prejudice grew side by side. Let's now return to the main path and follow the trail of rubber, a story that I think is as thrilling and tragic as any of the annals of empire. After Wickham's smuggling of seeds from Brazil, Kew scientists then raced to coax life from their very fragile cargo. They succeeded, and soon from Ceylon to Malaya to Singapore, vast plantations of rubber trees remake the landscape. Coffee collapses, rubber rises, and by the turn of the 20th century, rubber is actually Britain's golden crop. But this is wealth, of course, that comes at a price. In Brazil, indigenous peoples are massacred or driven into the forest, entire cultures extinguished for latex. In Malaya and Singapore, new fortunes bring new waves of migration. Indian and Chinese laborers work these plantations, their lives shaped, and I have to say, often broken by the demands of empire. The plantations themselves become arenas for resistance and violence. When the Malayan emergency erupts in 1948, it's as much about land and plants as it is about politics and flags. And here's the chilling detail. The British, facing communist insurgency, deploy not just bullets, but botanical warfare, destroying crops, burning villages, starving the rebels into submission. Kew's influence is everywhere, from seed to strategy. Let's linger just a moment longer in the shadow of empire. If rubber is the green gold of the 20th century, opium is its darker twin in the 19th. British botanists working for the East India Company experiment endlessly with the poppy, seeking the most potent strains, the best soils, and the highest yields. And of course, the profits are vast, the human cost staggering. When China actually attempts to halt the flood of British opium, war follows. Gunboats and soldiers, but also botanists and bureaucrats. By mid-century, and this is a staggering fact, up to a third of the adult male population in some Chinese provinces are addicted to opium. The story of empire is written not just in borders, but in blood and sap, and I have to say, in suffering and profit. So where does that leave us? As we wander back towards the gates, the lawns bright with children, the air humming with bees, today Kew is a place of wonder and learning, but it's also a place of reckoning. In recent years, directors and scholars have wrestled openly with the legacy of empire, adding labels that actually tell us the full story, sponsoring research that uncovers forgotten voices, publishing books that dig beneath the surface. And of course, as you can imagine, that hasn't always gone smoothly. The call to decolonize has sparked a fierce debate. Some want the past left undisturbed, others demand full transparency, honesty, and even apology. But the truth is, knowledge deepens beauty. To see the garden clearly, I think, is to love it more, not less, to honor its wonder and its wounds. Kew today is also a center for science, for conservation, and the fight to save species that are on the brink. The seed banks here may one day prove as important as all the imperial trophies of old. The gardens endures, and with it, I think, the hope that we can still grow something better from the tangled roots of our own history. So, as we finish our walk, with dust on our shoes, the scent of cut grass in the air, let's remember this. The story of Kew, of empire, of plants and people, it's not over. Every new leaf, every fresh planting is another page. And as we face a challenging climate and a very fragile world, the lessons of this garden, the power of curiosity, the cost of ambition, the need for humility, I think it matters more than ever. Something to think about. Now, earlier on, guys, I promised that I would talk a little bit about Joseph Banks, and I have to say, I'm a little bit enamored with the man, so excuse this excursion into Banks's world, but I think you'll also find it relatively interesting. So just for a moment, let's step away from the crowds and slip down a quieter path, one lined with ancient trees and shaded by the tangled arm of rhododendrons. There's a certain hush here, the kind of hush that settles in when you stand close to history. Not the blood and thunder sort, but the kind that changes the world one gentle leaf at a time. If you stop anyone here at Kew and ask them about the gardens and ask them about their most important figure, you'll get one answer again and again: Sir Joseph Banks. His name is absolutely everywhere. His story, I have to say, less so. But Banks, curious, privileged, determined, was the man who actually turned Kew from a royal hobby into a global powerhouse. And I think in doing so changed the complete face of empire, also science, and I say with conviction, the world itself. So, who was Joseph Banks? Let's go back to the beginning. Joseph Banks was actually born in 1743 into the sort of wealth and status that gives boys ideas. His father was an MP, his mother came from a line of landed gentry, and the family estates in Lincolnshire, they were the sort of place where you could actually get lost for days among the meadows and the woods without ever seeing another human being. Even as a child, Banks had a restless curiosity, the curiosity of a boy who would never settle for the ordinary. There's a wonderful story from his school days. Young Joseph challenging the superstition that toads actually cause warts. Remember that one? He marches into class and picks up a toad and proceeds to rub it all over his face, to the absolute horror and delight of his classmates. And I think it's here where you get the first hint of a man who would travel to the ends of the earth for the sake of science, sensation, and a bloody good story. His passion for plants began early, though it was much more about wild collecting than careful study. Banks really wasn't much for Latin names or taxonomic detail as a boy. He actually loved the thrill of the hunt. He would be scouring fields, for rare wildflowers, keeping pressed specimens in leather-bound books, daydreaming, I suppose, of far-off lands. At the appropriate age, he was sent off to Harrow and then to Eton before moving on to Oxford, a place in those days more concerned, I have to say, with tradition rather than innovation. Banks found the lectures dull, the atmosphere stifling. Instead, he would haunt the woods. He befriended the gardeners, and he spent hours alone in the university's modest psychic garden. In the evenings, he read the accounts of old plant hunters and explorers, I suppose imagining himself on the banks of the Orinoco or deep in the forests of the South Pacific. He never actually finished his degree, a small scandal at that time, but left with something I think very much more valuable, the conviction that science was best done in the field, not in study. By his early 20s, he had inherited the family fortune, and with it, the freedom to chase his curiosity wherever it might lead. And I think that kind of takes him very close to becoming the world's greatest ever plant hunter. London in the 1760s was alive with talk of exploration. The Royal Society, that august gathering of scientists and enlightened gentlemen, was the center of it all. Banks joins at age 23, quickly making a name for himself with his collections and, of course, his relentless energy. And then came the chance that would define his life: James Cook's first voyage to the South Pacific. The British Admiralty wanted to send an expedition to observe the transit of Venus, an absolute cosmic event that might finally reveal the size of our solar system. But of course, the real agenda bubbling below the waves was imperial: map new territories, claim them for the crown, and if possible, bring back green riches. Banks, of course, saw his chance, and he offered to pay his own way, contributing £10,000 of his fortune. As I mentioned before, that's about £1.5 million in today's money. And of course, he was never going to do it alone. His nickname was Party Boy Banks, and he took his incredible team with him: Daniel Solander, a Swedish botanist trained by Linnaeus, Hermann Sporing, a Finnish naturalist and instrument maker, and of course, a dozen or so artists, assistants, and servants. Much, I have to say, to Cook's anger. The Endeavour actually set sail in 1768. It went to Madeira, to Rio de Janeiro, to Tierra del Fuego, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia. And at every stop, Banks and his team would literally plunge into the wilderness, collecting plants, drawing and preserving specimens, recording observations in careful script and vivid watercolor. They slept in tents. They would have battled fevers and braved storms and shipwrecks. And at one point, a frog, clearly meant for study, leapt into Banks's mouth. A reminder, I think, that science is rarely as dignified as it appears in the portraits. When Banks returned to England in 1771, he was an absolute celebrity. Londoners thronged to hear his stories. Society ladies competed for dried wildflowers and rare seeds. He published his journals and his reputation absolutely soared. Of course, it helped that he was very tall and very good looking and very wealthy. And of course, at this stage, he was in his late 20s, but already he was the most famous botanist in Britain, possibly the world. And then he set about transforming Kew. Banks became unofficial director, guiding its plant collectors, advising the king, and helping shape British imperial policy. He was absolutely tireless, sometimes working till 3 o'clock in the morning, writing hundreds of letters, orchestrating expeditions to Africa, the Americas, India, the Far East. His network stretched from the Arctic to the Cape and from Calcutta to Rio. It was Banks who saw that plants could be the engines of empire. He actually masterminded the movement of breadfruit from Tahiti to the West Indies. As I said, it was an effort to, feed these enslaved laborers very cheaply with disastrous results, because these enslaved people detested the fruit because it became a symbol of their captivity. He also imported tea from China, improved cotton in the West Indies, and sponsored collectors who scoured the world for everything from medicinal herbs to timber trees. Banks was an absolute paradox, a man of science and a man of empire, obsessed with the free exchange of knowledge, but also, I think, with the accumulation of wealth and power. He believed in the global commons of botany, but never doubted the right of Britain to claim and profit from whatever grew under the sun. His legacy? Well, today, Banks's portrait hangs in the Joseph Banks building at Kew. His name is on streets throughout London and schools across the world. He was, I think, by any standard, a genius of organization, a visionary who saw that science could actually serve society, a mentor to generations of botanists and gardeners to come. But I think he was also a man of his time, blind to the suffering that empire so often inflicted and to the lives uprooted by his plant hunting ambitions. He thought nothing of moving breadfruit, quinine, or rubber across the continent, with very little regard for the peoples who depended on them. He worked incredibly closely with the East India Company. He advised on penal colonies in Australia, and he also championed projects that preserved both science and profit. And yet, Kew, as we know it, would not exist without him. The very idea of the modern botanic garden as a place of beauty, of science, and global connection, it's inseparable from Joseph Banks's name. So I'll ask you this. The next time you find yourself at Kew, perhaps beneath the soaring glass of the Palm House or wandering among the beds Banks himself actually helped plant, just pause for a moment. Close your eyes and listen to the echo of distant voices, of Cook's sailors calling out, of Solander sketching wildflowers by lantern late into the night, of Banks dictating a letter to a collector in Jamaica or Java. Look at the labels on the plants. Look at their Latin names, their histories, their journeys. Each is a legacy of Banks's relentless curiosity, his relentless ambition, his complicated vision of a world both conquered and connected by plants. And as the breeze stirs the leaves overhead, remember, this was the man who rewrote the world, one specimen, one voyage, one garden at a time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening in. I wish you an amazing week ahead, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye for now.